Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and you're welcome to the Goldsmith International Literary Festival. We're going to be starting in about 3 or 4 minutes. There is a queue of people waiting to join, and it's taken a couple of seconds for each person to access the webinar. So if you just enjoy the flute music being played by one of our members, Donny Keys, and we will be commencing proceedings, I would imagine, within 3 to 4 minutes. It's just to clear the queue of people to join the webinar. Thank you very much. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and you're very, very welcome to the 37th Goldsmith International Literary Festival. At the moment, we have a large number of attendees, but I know that there's a lot more attendees out there. So some people, if there are some people that you know are trying to get on, maybe if they refresh their attendance link, but the attendees are building up. So I think we'll start, and we're hoping that people, as it goes on, then we'll be able to join in comfortably. So I'd like to welcome, first of all, I suppose, old friends of the festival, people who have attended us physically for years, and a very, very special welcome to people who have, this is their first experience of the Goldsmith Festival. You're all very, very welcome. We're here in the Goldsmith Room in Ballymahon Library. Ballymahon is a town in the heart of the hidden heartlands, here in the Longford Westmeath area, sometimes known as Goldsmith Country. And not too far from here, that direction is Palace, where Goldsmith was born in 1728. And over this way is Lissoy, where Goldsmith lived in the early part of his life, and from where in 1756 he left for London, where he became a great novelist, dramatist, and poet. And he left an indelible mark on the history of literature, to the extent that his novels are still read, his plays are still performed, and his poetry and prose are still studied and analysed. From 1985, 37 editions of the Goldsmith Festival have used Goldsmith's works as a springboard to discuss contemporary issues. And especially close to Goldsmith's heart was the issue of rural life and agriculture, the bold peasantry. And that's where our theme this year comes from, and that's why we have selected the speakers we have selected. We are a social, cultural, and literary event, and we can offer the social and the cultural, but we have to leave the social, unfortunately. So we can offer the cultural and the literary, but we have to leave the social until next year. I'd like to thank the local councils, Longford and Westmeath, and indeed, I think the authorities in general, for the support they have given our festival and other cultural festivals. It is very important. It's part of the social fabric, and I think a great effort has been made to preserve festivals like this. But nothing beats the live event, the shared experience of seeing and feeling the reactions of others. Usually, for 37 years, we would be making this speech in Abbeyshroll, in the beautiful village of Abbeyshroll, home of the McGoey family, long associated with the festival. This year, we are online for the first time, and that brings its own challenges. We've rehearsed and we've planned for a number of contingencies, and we all know technology is fantastic. But because ultimately technology was created by man, it is fallible. Your own broadband may be an issue. We are monitoring the output here, but something can still go wrong. In the event of a cyber attack, I have spoken with the treasurer, and we will not be paying a ransom. So for tonight, then, I'd like to introduce you to your host for tonight, Claire McCormack. Claire is local from Myvor, just out the road, and she has a master's in sustainable agriculture and rural development, a master's in English, and a master's in journalism. So I think she's slightly overqualified for a Goldsmith webinar, but anyway, she's currently a farming and rural affairs reporter with the Irish Independent and the Farming Independent. But by far, Claire's most important role is as the PRO of our committee. So now I'd like to hand you over to your host for the evening, Claire McCormack, and I hope everybody enjoys the evening.
Thanks, Arthur, and welcome everyone to this year's Goldsmith International Literary Festival, dedicated to the life and works of the iconic Longford-born and Westmeath-raised novelist, playwright, and poet. While we are unable to have you all here in person in the Goldsmith room in Ballymahon Library, we've organised a wide-ranging virtual event that we hope you will enjoy and engage with throughout the weekend. Our theme this year is the deserted village as rural virtues leave the land, the environmental, economic and social sustainability of Irish agriculture. Now, you might be wondering why we decided to focus our theme on the future of agriculture. Well, we live in a region that is highly dependent on our farmers. This is the heart of suckler country, as I'm often reminded. Plus, we also are surrounded by our sheep, dairy, pig, poultry, and some tillage farms that make an invaluable contribution to our local economy. But with so much change coming to farming practice because of greater climate change and environmental obligations, we wanted to take this opportunity to present to you some of the foremost thinkers and communicators in the field to talk to us about what's really going on and what it all means for how we cultivate the land. And of course, it will all be framed within the writings of Oliver Goldsmith, who always kept his rural roots close to his pen. As you know, our programme will run over the next 3 days, each dedicated to one of the three main pillars of sustainability: environmental sustainability, economic and social sustainability. And you are most welcome to join us as we explore our theme with the country's most revered agricultural, economic, literary and environmental minds. Plus, we will also have critical input from our local farmers and rural dwellers. There's also a chat function available on screen if you want to input any questions or comments about the festival or the presentations throughout. And if you're joining us on social media, you can tweet about the festival with the hashtag Goldsmith21. But first, to officially open the 37th year, we are honoured and delighted to be joined by the Minister for Agriculture, Food and the Marine, Charlie McConalogue, who sent us this video message.
Hello everybody. It's a real honour to have been asked to address the 37th annual Oliver Goldsmith International Literary Festival this beautiful bank holiday weekend. The Goldsmith Literary Festival is one of the most engaging and enjoyable festivals of its kind, and it's with great pride that I was asked to address such an august group, especially seeing the title of the conference this year. The Goldsmith Festival does such a tremendous job in promoting stimulating debate on relevant topics. I wish your other contributors well, including Professor James Kinsella of UCD School of Agriculture and Food Science, Professor Michael Griffin of the UL School of English, Professor John Fitzgerald, economist, my Oireachtas colleague, independent TD Michael Fitzmaurice, Dr. Monica Gorman of the UCD School of Agriculture, actor and modern-day bard Seamus O'Rourke, rural writer John Connell, and many others. Like so many other events of your kind, I commend the committee for being able to move so seamlessly to the online world to ensure your festival could continue this year. I know this has posed enormous logistical and operational issues, but it is critical that cultural events and festivals have continued during the COVID-19 pandemic. You've played a huge part in lifting the mood of our people. It is my great hope that as our vaccination programme continues to roll out, that we will be in a position to meet together in time for next year's festival. And I know you will all very much join with me in that sentiment. Remember, our greatest glory consists not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. As a nation, we fell in the last year, but thankfully we're getting up together. I know the theme of the festival this year is entitled The Deserted Village. As rural virtues leave the land, the environmental, economic and social sustainability of Irish agriculture. It is the 251st anniversary of Goldsmith's famous poem. As Minister for Agriculture, Food and the Marine, I often like to say that in reality that I am Minister for the land and water and everything associated with it. Having a vibrant and sustainable agriculture sector and environment is my singular focus as Minister, Without a thriving farming sector married with a sustainable environment, our 14 billion export sector is worthless. There are huge challenges facing our agriculture sector, from a new common agricultural policy that would look very different to the last CAP, meeting our climate change ambitions while feeding the world in a sustainable way, and continuing to deal with the fallout of Brexit. However, despite all these challenges, I know there are huge opportunities for our sector and for our farmers. I'm committed to ensuring that our agriculture sector continues to be supported and well funded in order to allow our primary producers do what they do best, making world-class, safe, nutritious, traceable and sustainable food. Ireland is the real food capital of the world, and we must do all we can to protect our sector, to ensure that as the global economy continues to grow, that we are well placed to meet this demand for high-quality food. Farming continues to renew its social licence with the people and the land. We must continually be aware of the challenges we face, but I know there is a tremendously bright future for our farmers and our sector. It's with that thought that I'm reminded of Goldsmith's words in The Deserted Village. Princes and lords may flourish or may fade. A breath can make them as a breath has made. But a bold peasantry, their country's pride, when once destroyed, can never be supplied. Even now, methinks, as pondering here I stand, I see the rural virtues leave the land. Farming will not become a deserted village, and we will not see the real virtues, or farmers or food producers leave the land. Our primary producers and our country's pride will continue to be for many generations. To conclude, I thank you all for the invitation to join you today, and I wish you a very successful and stimulating few days. And with that, I am delighted to declare the 2021 annual Oliver Goldsmith International Literary Festival officially open. Thank you and good luck, and enjoy the festival.
Thank you kindly, Minister, for your warm and generous welcome and for your vital insights on the CAP reform and the challenges we all face within the sector. I'm sure they will be raised at numerous points over the course of the weekend. Now, though, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Jim Kinsella, Professor of Agricultural Extension and Rural Development at the School of Agriculture and Food Science in UCD. Professor Kinsella began his career in Africa as a volunteer humanitarian worker in Ethiopia in 1985 and as a volunteer agricultural development worker in Tanzania. On returning to Ireland in the early 1990s, he completed his PhD study on Irish farm households' decision-making processes and became a lecturer in UCD in 1995. He has, over the past 25 years, lectured on sustainable agriculture and rural development, communications, and agricultural extension. He has established and coordinated master's programs in sustainable agriculture and rural development and agricultural innovation support. His research encompasses rural livelihoods, agricultural extension and innovation, labour on farms, and social farming. He lives with his family on a small farm in South Kilkenny and remains actively involved in his local community. Professor Kinsella, we are absolutely privileged to welcome you to our festival, and I'll hand over to you now for your presentation entitled Learning from the Past to Strike the Best Balance for Sustainable Agriculture in the Future.
Thanks, Claire. I didn't recognize myself from the introduction, so it's really nice to be asked, and good evening to everyone. I'm delighted to be invited, and indeed it was Claire who invited me. I look back through my emails, it was February 2020 in the pre-COVID times that some of us still remember fondly, when I had hoped to travel up from South Kilkenny and to the festival in Ballyman, but that will be for another time. I thought about the topic, and I thought about a number of things in terms of how best to address such a broad issue. And when I was invited to contribute, I was prompted to think about, well, what does sustainable agriculture actually look like? And how Goldsmith's deserted village scenario mirrors the challenges facing rural and agricultural communities in Ireland today. And this opening image is from the top of the Blacknock Hill, looking down over the countryside where I grew up and still live in South Kilkenny. And it kind of represents, I think, much of what we're talking about when we're talking about sustainable agriculture. The term sustainable agriculture is increasingly used in our discussions about the future of agriculture and indeed the future of wider society. Yet it's not always fully appreciated in terms of what it looks like in practice, and more importantly, what it means for all of us, farm households, rural populations, and consumers, urban and rural. I particularly like Richard Harwood's definition, which emphasizes the notion of balance and implies the intergenerational dimension in terms of evolving indefinitely towards greater human utility. Now I'll get to the story part of it. On recently becoming a grandfather myself, I reflected on my own grandfather, who farmed up to the early 1960s, and along with my grandmother, managed to build a good farm business while maintaining a vibrant rural setting that I recognize from my own childhood. And this slide shows the river by my grandparents' farm in the 1960s and how I enjoyed the freedoms and opportunities that it afforded. So growing up on a small, mixed farm in South Kilkenny in the 1960s provided me the experience of an Ireland in which wild hedgerows and riverbanks were full of plants and wildlife. The pastures were mixed, colourful and uneven. And even the cows were more colourful, with reds, roans, greys and browns mixed in with some of the black and white Frisians. The ditches were wide and sometimes wild, ideal for making forts in which to play. Goldsmith captured the scenario nicely in The Deserted Village when he wrote, "Dear lovely bowers of innocence and ease, seats of my youth, when every sport could please, how often have I loitered o'er thy green, where humble happiness endeared each scene." Over the 50 to 60 years that followed, we experienced a seismic change in agriculture to where we find ourselves today. And so I asked myself, what can we learn from the past, and why did we lose some of our good and valued practices along the way? In responding to this growing debate on sustainable agriculture, and in particular highlighting the contribution of an old style of farming, now popularly referred to as agroecological farming, which is all about reducing and minimizing external inputs such as artificial fertilizers and chemicals, and making the most of the existing resources of the farm, such as soils, manures, labor, and knowledge. This short presentation reflects on farming of the past and how we can perhaps take valuable lessons from my grandparents' generation to help towards a more sustainable agriculture in the future. I want to start my story with the 1960s in Ireland and consider the nature of farming at the time. Ireland in the 1960s had around 240,000 farms, which is twice as many as there are today. The Irish government were starting to make serious efforts to grow and strengthen the economy through its programs of economic expansion of the 1960s. These programs aimed to increase production from the maximum number of farm families and enable strong and progressive rural communities. Farmers were being advised and supported to increase productivity. This slide shows my grandfather and grandmother with visiting family members in 1960. It also shows the Cyclopedia of Modern Agriculture, which was so important to my grandparents' way of farming, and I'll refer to this a little bit later. The farming practices of the 1960s represented a type of farming that was very diverse and required both a depth and breadth of knowledge by farmers, many of whom operated mixed farming systems that combined arable crops, livestock, small animals, and vegetables. My grandparents farmed 50 acres of land on which they had dairy cows, beef cattle, barley, oats, sugar beet, turnips, potatoes, and cabbages, as well as 10 sows and 6 workhorses. They weren't an exception in their farming community. They were simply good farmers, as were many other hard-working farm households in the area. My grandfather, like many of his generation, barely attended primary school and was almost totally self-taught. He had a big appetite for knowledge, and particularly knowledge on farming. A prized possession of his was the Cyclopedia of Modern Agriculture. While the 10 volumes remain unmarked and unblemished today, almost 60 years since he last referred to it, there were many small notes and markers inserted in what were clearly the most used pages and most referred to pages of the various volumes. According to my father, my grandfather also liked to learn from his trips to the local creamery, where he happily chatted with neighbours on everything from farming to the weather and back to farming again. I guess farming was his thing. Our entry to the EEC, now the European Union, in 1973 was a game changer. It accelerated the modernising of Irish farming for the next 20 years. The 1970s in particular were regarded as the most prosperous era of Irish farming. We availed of farm modernisation grants that encouraged a rapid intensification and specialisation of our farming, with new farm buildings, tanks, yards, land reclamation, emerging as the new symbols of what constituted good farming. The game changed, and many farmers responded. However, this was at a cost to our natural and cultural assets, which are embedded in Irish farming. Hedgerows were ripped out, ditches were bulldozed, and old buildings were demolished to make way for new sheds and yards and bigger fields. The digger was king. In addition to the farm structural changes in the 1970s and 80s, many farmers became more specialised in their farming and consequently lost their broad knowledge base of managing a greater diversity of plants and animals. This era of modernisation of Irish farming also brought with it other consequences in terms of the social and human capital of farming communities, as epitomised by the replacement of the social gatherings associated with the collection of milk at the local creameries, being replaced by the more socially distanced collection of milk on farms by bulk milk tankers. This slide shows our local creamery in the 1950s, which was a vibrant hub of activity, including sharing of knowledge and gossip. It's now a for sale derelict building, having finally closed in 2004. Resulting from the EU CAP reforms of the late 1980s, a series of agri-environmental schemes emerged in the 1990s and helped to both highlight and address some of the destruction of natural and cultural resources which had happened. These schemes have helped to recognise that there is more than just one commodity that can be produced by farms. And there are also valuable public goods and services which can be produced, such as clean water, an abundance of biodiversity, the aesthetics of the landscape, and the therapeutic effects of working with and in nature, all of which are governed by how we farm. This slide is of two of my daughters navigating some of the wild areas en route to the river, which was protected and enhanced by these agri-environmental schemes. This story is not unique to Ireland. James Redbank's recent book, English Pastoral and Inheritance, tells a very similar story as it relates to the northeast of England, and quotes an elderly farmer who says, "Tell them about what happened on the land. Someone has to tell them. When I was young, there were cowslips and ragdrobin everywhere and butterflies on the thyme in the rocky crags and fells. The becks were full of minnows, the pools alive with them, and the water boatmen skating on the top. I may be old and stupid, but I like to see them things. But you don't see them anymore. And greed is to blame. And it will get worse if they don't change things. Tell them." So where are we now? The changes in Irish agriculture over this past 50 years or more have been driven by an increasingly globalized economy, by rapidly changing technologies, by consumer and societal demands, and by the shift from predominantly rural to urban populations. In 1960, around 2/3 of the global population was rural. Nowadays, it's almost 40%. Clearly, the political muscle of farming and rural communities is not what it was. A recent international conference on work in agriculture highlighted its concern about our current trajectory in farming. It suggested that if we continue the trends of the past 50 years, we're heading towards a model of farming without farmers, made up instead of holders of capital, salaried workers, and hyper-mechanization. And this gives a sense of what could happen if we continue on our current path. And the outcome of this would be akin to Goldsmith's deserted village scenario. Since the 1960s, increased farm size and technology-driven intensification has allowed many farms to realize better incomes relative to less intensive and traditional farms. This has happened because of the protection of markets, the availability of cheap credit, and technological developments combined with the absence of effective environmental policies and the lack of awareness among the general public about issues such as food quality, animal welfare, and environmental degradation. An increasingly strong technical support by agro-industries has also played a crucial role in spreading more industrial and modern agricultural techniques. This slide depicts a prairie-like approach to farming, which has resulted from our modernizing agriculture. Catherine Keener refers to it as a dairy prairie. However, over the past 10 to 15 years, most of these contextual elements have changed. Europe's agricultural markets have been deregulated, with the subsequent emergence of price uncertainties. There has been a general economic and financial crisis, a rise in the growing recognition of the need to reduce carbon emissions, mitigate against climate change, and address animal welfare issues. Together, these changes have placed downward pressure on farm incomes. We're also being increasingly told that we are obliterating our biodiversity, and that the way in which we have managed our natural environment is contributing to irreversible and damaging climate change that will impact profoundly on our quality of life. All of this fundamentally challenges and worries me in regards to the legacy that I will leave my grandchildren. Part of the solution lies in returning to some of the good farming practices of the 1960s in the form of agroecological farming. Agroecological farming is inherently much more than farming without chemical inputs. It involves ways of farming that are very different from those contained in more conventional agriculture of today. It includes a range of pathways such as conservation agriculture, low external input farming, organic agriculture, agroforestry, and integrated crop and livestock farming. There are three things that we know for definite about agroecological farming. Firstly, it is about the reduction in the use of external inputs and a simultaneous improvement in the quality and use of inputs that are on the farm. Secondly, it is dynamic. It involves ongoing improvements which are often driven by farmer-to-farmer sharing of experiences. This knowledge sharing and building of social capital helps to make agriculture more sustainable and more resilient. And thirdly, it can improve farming incomes, create more employment, and strengthen the resilience of farms and rural areas. This slide shows extracts of the Cyclopedia of Modern Agriculture that I referred to before. And these extracts were the well-used parts of my grandfather's cyclopedia, in which he developed a deep knowledge of the composition of farm manure and of the best grass species and grass mixtures for managing his grassland. Across Europe, increasing attention is being given to this agroecological farming as both a pathway and a solution. While my grandparents might not have labelled their farming approach as agroecological, this term was not in the cyclopedia, it met many of the characteristics of agroecological farming as listed by the United Nations, such as recycling of on-farm resources, reduction of purchased inputs or bought inputs, good soil and animal health, maintaining and enhancing biodiversity, having synergies between animal and crop production systems, and the co-creation of knowledge with other farmers. These are key characteristics of agroecological farming. So my grandparents' farming would have ticked many of the above practices and been viewed as strongly agroecological. There are recent developments in agroecological farming in Ireland, with one example being the move to low-cost grass-fed production, which has become increasingly important for economically efficient dairy and beef farming. This has seen a shift from the more high-input production systems for milk and beef to more balanced and sustainable systems based on efficient grassland management, which is supported by the growing role of farmer discussion groups that help farmers to share knowledge amongst themselves. This approach involves improved soil and grassland management underpinned by practices such as good soil nutrient planning, grass measuring, and grass clover sward maintenance. Lest we think that agroecological farming is only for the small to medium and extensive farms, it's equally relevant for highly intensive and specialised farms, such as expanding dairy farms, to adopt these agroecological practices. Research by Catherine Keena and Aoife Leader with dairy farms in Ireland has shown that many are keen to address the decline in biodiversity on their farms by improving hedgerow management, protection of waterways, and undertaking other measures to encourage biodiversity on their farms. These farmers are critical to the solutions we look to in food production, climate mitigation, and enhancing biodiversity. Also, the recent and positive development in Ireland of the newly promoted REAP Agri-Environment Pilot Project, which pays farmers to maintain and improve the environmental conditions of their land. Under this project, farmers will undertake environmental improvements on their land. Farms with higher environmental scores will receive larger payments, while currently new and small in scale. This pilot project is important as it encourages and supports agroecological farming practices, such as low input grasslands and multi-species swards, and sets a basis for what can come and can happen in the new schemes associated with CAP reform in 2023. So, overall, there is a very strong case that agroecological approaches can make a substantial contribution to a more sustainable agriculture in Ireland and globally. Looking across the Irish farming landscape, like everything else in life, you can look at it and choose to see what's right, or you can choose to see what's wrong. I look at it optimistically, and I see it as a rich resource that we can reconfigure towards a more sustainable future. So what are the lessons which can help us to strike this good balance? First of all, we need to recognize that there is conflict between our perception of good farming and good natural resource management on farms. We know it is possible to effectively manage the farm's natural resources in a good farming way, as did my grandparents. Farming exists in a complex and ever-changing environment which requires farm households to be dynamic and make adjustments in accordance with the opportunities and challenges that exist. We now have both the opportunity and challenge of creating a more sustainable agriculture in Ireland and globally. Farming is knowledge intensive, always has been, and lifelong learning by farm households is essential to allow good decision making for more sustainable farming. Farming is at the heart of our duty of care and responsibility to the next generations. We are all responsible. Farm households, rural populations, and the ever-increasing urban population in enabling farming to best position itself in this space. There's a need for a mindset shift among all stakeholders, from farmers to the general public, who are the consumers, to appreciate and value an agroecological approach to our agriculture, and to put in place lasting supports to adopt some of the good practices of the past. So can we achieve a better balance by preserving and perhaps reclaiming the rich experiences reflected in the pre-desertification of rural Ireland as captured by Goldsmith? I believe it is possible to reclaim Goldsmith's ideal of the cultivated farm, the never-failing brook, the busy mill, the decent church that topped the neighbouring hill, the hawthorn bush with seats beneath the shade, for talking age and whispering lovers maid. To achieve this, we need to learn from the past generations and embrace a more agroecological approach to farming. Thanks for this opportunity to share this story and perspective with you.
Thank you very much for that extremely thoughtful reflection on the evolution of farming in Ireland, Professor Kinsella, and it was a very powerful and frank presentation on where we are and what needs to happen. I found myself nodding along with your presentation throughout, as I'm sure many of our viewers did. In fact, we got some messages in throughout praising your broad approach to the subject and saying it was very interesting. So thank you very much, Jim. Now next up, we have Dr. Michael Griffin. He is a senior lecturer in English at the University of Limerick. Dr. Griffin is the author of Enlightenment in Ruins, the Geographies of Oliver Goldsmith. He edited a publication on 18th century Ballymore poet and influence on Goldsmith, Lawrence White, in 2016. The Letters of Oliver Goldsmith, which he co-edited with David O'Shaughnessy of Trinity College Dublin, was published in 2018 by Cambridge University Press. He will also be working for the next several years on a new edition of Collected Works of Oliver Goldsmith, also for Cambridge University Press. Dr. Griffin, it is a great honour to welcome you back to the festival this year. I'll hand over to you now for your session entitled The Deserted Village at 251 Years.
Thanks very much, Claire. It's a great pleasure to join you this evening. It's just a shame, of course, that we can't be social in the way that we ordinarily are. So you can hear me okay, and I hope. And what I will do now is I will put up my presentation. Sorry, bear with me now. I just need the screen share. There we go. Thanks again, Claire, and thanks also to Jim. That was a wonderfully evocative talk, and I was especially taken with the idea of the intergenerational responsibility to hand on a landscape and a society and a way of farming that can keep us and that we can keep. That sort of intergenerational responsibility and the idea of inheritance, I think, is very important in Goldsmith's thought and in his writing. And it's actually an idea that he shares with the person that's across the front of Trinity College, the statue, of which there is a cast there in Ballymahon. He's across the way from Edmund Burke, who of course was also a very important thinker about the importance of inheritance and intergenerational responsibility. So I think your talk was wonderfully evocative on that, and also teased out some of Goldsmith's resonance, ongoing resonance to us in the 21st century. So I'm going to talk just about the poem, really. As Claire mentioned, I'm editing Goldsmith's works with colleagues in Trinity College Dublin and in the University of York in England over the next several years. And at the moment, I am actually editing and annotating The Deserted Village, which is perhaps his most famous work. It depends on who you ask, really. Sometimes people will say that The Vicar of Wakefield, if they're fans of 18th century fiction, or She Stoops to Conquer, if they're enthusiasts for the theatre. But I'm inclined to think, and I wouldn't be alone in this, as an Irish reader of Goldsmith's work, that The Deserted Village is perhaps his greatest achievement, and it's one which has been illustrated and beautifully reupholstered over the intervening 250 years. As you can see, the title slide that I put here is a copy of The Deserted Village from 1907, which I recently acquired, illustrated by the Aberdeen visual artist of the later 19th, early 20th century, Stephen Reid, who's also a famous illustrator of Irish mythology. And here we see the pensive, or the sad historian of the pensive plain, the woman who is driven by poverty to pick mantling cresses in order to feed herself, obviously a victim of straitened circumstances in the wake of the agricultural ruin which the poem describes. So what I'm going to do is, is talk to you about, well, four things centrally. I'm going to talk to you about Goldsmith, first of all, and why his great poem is so relevant to us 250 years later. I'm going to talk about the composition and the publication and the reception of The Deserted Village. I'm going to talk about a few key passages from the poem, and also just to give a sort of a sense of what it is that I do in annotating certain passages, just to kind of, I suppose, help the contemporary reader to find their way into some of the context in which Goldsmith wrote, and also to talk about its resonance in Ireland to the present day, and specifically, I think, through the writings of other contemporary Irish poets, perhaps key amongst them being John Montague. But it's The Deserted Village is a poem which has been very important to other writers, such as Mhona O'Rourke, who is from the Midlands, from Longford, has been a visitor to the Goldsmith Summer School and Literary Festival in the past. But the Deserted Village resonates in the writings of John McGahern, and in our recently departed great poet, Evan Boland, who famously wrote a poem called On Reading the Deserted Village in 21st century Ireland. So yes, just to begin, I'll just put the little side slide down. So who was Goldsmith, and why is he and his great poem, The Deserted Village, relevant to us in 2021? Well, in the age of Brexit, I like to think of him as a sort of a seer, as somebody who was able to comment on contemporary British affairs from the slightly critical perspective of an Irishman, and somebody who, alongside his Irishness, had cultivated over many years a European sensibility, because as Arthur pointed out, he arrived in London in the later 1750s, but between his youth and his education in Trinity College Dublin, he travelled throughout Europe, first to Edinburgh, and then on throughout the continent. He educated himself in medicine at Edinburgh and subsequently at Leiden, and travelled throughout France, Germany, and Italy, and was also a very accomplished linguist. So he was able to absorb a lot of European culture, and in fact, he would earn a living for himself as a translator of many European, specifically French writers when he arrived in London. And that really became his bread and butter, if you like, was his ability to work and to translate for an English audience some of the great writings of his European contemporaries and near contemporaries. So he was working in the gig economy, so he knew what it was to have a sort of a precarious existence. And he wrote across and straddled the genres with some ease. So, as Arthur mentioned at the outset, a very fine poet, very fine novelist, an acclaimed playwright. But what's often forgotten is he was also a professor of history, and wrote histories of Greece, Rome, England, and also a history of animated nature, an 8-volume work of a compendium, if you like, of natural history, in which he expressed, I think, some of the sort of the empathy with animal life and a kind of a sympathetic identification with the natural world, which speaks to some of Jim's themes there of the idea of ecological responsibility. And I think that fed back into his great poem of 1770 as well. So he was wary of chauvinism, he was wary of excessive nationalism, And in an English context at that time, so once he arrived in London, bringing to bear his outsider's perspective, he became very anti-imperialistic. And you could say that he became anti-globalistic, just to kind of harken back there to Jim's concept that globalization really is one of the things that threatens perhaps a more sustainable way of being and of farming. So for him, in his context, that globalization took the form of imperial expansion. And what imperial expansion also provided for the powers that be in Britain was a sort of an escape hatch for the population, which meant that people were emigrating to the New World, to the new colonies, in a way which Goldsmith did not approve of, because as he saw it, that was basically sort of a hemorrhaging of the rural population to further flung parts of the world. And all of this happened at the expense of social well-being at home. So he was wary also of urbanization, and that's another thing that the deserted village deals with, is not just the process of emigration to Georgia, as he describes it in the poem, along the banks of the Altamaha River, but also into the cities which are beginning to expand as the agricultural revolution and the beginnings of the industrial revolution start to take hold. And urbanization in the Ireland in which he grew up was also a concern. And I'll touch upon this a little bit later on as well. There were large parts of the rural population that migrated to the city of Dublin in the 1740s, not least because of the famine which took place in 1740 and 1741, something which Goldsmith was himself a very troubled observer of. Because of the deep freeze that happened in those 2 years, the land couldn't sustain its population. And provision for the rural poor was not all that it should have been. And there was a large kind of shift, a geographical shift in the Irish population. So this is, his importance as a kind of an agricultural observer, an observer of rural life is something, was important in his own context, but it's the reason why his poem still resonates with us today. And it's the reason why it is a poem much loved and quoted in Ireland, even by ministers of agriculture. And we've just seen a minister of agriculture quote, I think, what is probably the most effective political passage in the poem. Ill fares the land to hastening ills of prey, where wealth accumulates and men decay. And I'll come back to that passage as well. So that's the reason why John Montagu, who's writing in the 1970s and 80s, he was a great poet in his own right, but also a scholar of Goldsmith's work. And his essay, The Sentimental Prophecy, really teases out the importance of Goldsmith for his own poetical practice, but also his sense of his own background growing up in rural Ulster. So the composition of the poem, just to give you a little bit of background on that 250 years ago. So, as I say, these are themes that were important to Goldsmith throughout his early life, and he'd been developing his ideas throughout his literary career, but he really began to compose the poem in earnest in 1768, so 2 years prior to its publication on May the 26th, 1770. It was published by an Irish printer in London by the name of William Griffin, no relation. But he had been thinking about these ideas since he composed an essay called The Revolution in Low Life, which we published in Lloyd's Evening Post in June of 1762. That's sometimes referred to as the deserted village in prose. And he begins to develop some of his themes of land and depopulation, the importance of keeping the rural population in a sustainable environment, because that really was the strength of the nation as he understood it, the strength of the Irish nation, which he left behind, but also the strength of the English nation, to which he was very sympathetic and which had become his home. And he also touched upon some of these concepts in his other great poem, The Traveller, or A Prospect of Society. And there he laments the increasing commercialization of the world and of his world, and the emphasis on wealth and opulence of the few, which would lead stern depopulation in their wake. And again, I'm thinking of what Jim had to say there about the danger that the land could be given over purely to the holders of capital, as opposed to the people who depend upon it. So I think he was drawing upon his Irish upbringing, obviously, but he was also observing some developments around him in England at that time. And this actually created something of a dissonance amongst his critics in 1770 when the poem was first released. British critics weren't entirely convinced that the social ills which he described were as real as he thought them to be. And I think that's because they weren't perhaps taking as seriously as he did what it is that he'd seen in Ireland. And I'll move on to that in a moment. Because they would have seen developments in England at that time and thought, well, things seem to be going pretty well. The English economy is expanding, thanks in large part to imperialism and the phenomena of enclosure and the privatization of lands, which Goldsmith decried. For them, it was actually, they saw that as, and many economic observers in Britain at the time saw that as a positive economic development and something which made farms more efficient. So he composed the poem partially in the surrounds, in the rural surrounds outside of London, along the Edgware Road, which of course is now in London, but about 8 miles from the city boundaries as they were defined in 1770. So not long before the poem was published, Goldsmith's brother Henry, to whom he dedicated the Traveller or Prospect of Society, had died, and his passing was a profound event in Goldsmith's life. And instead of Henry then, The Deserted Village was dedicated to Joshua Reynolds. And readers of the poem will know that the dedication is, it's a forum in which Goldsmith seeks to describe his economic thesis. And he says there that he understands that some critics will object to his economic argument, but he swears that he has seen what it is that he's writing about and wants to make a sustained political argument in the form of poetry about recent developments in politics and society. But he put a tremendous amount of effort into his poetry, more so than he ever could, I think, into his prose, because he was producing such a vast amount of prose throughout the 1760s just to keep food on his table. But the two major poems, The Traveller and The Deserted Village, he really put an extraordinary amount of himself into those two works. So he'd been collecting the materials on his country excursions for the poem and was actually engaged in the construction of it above 2 years, says William Cook, who in an article in the European magazine, or a series of articles in 1793, helped us to reconstruct the process which Goldsmith went through in order to create this poem. And he would revise and revise and revise, as Cook indicates, those poems. And you can even see some of that revision that takes place over the course of the early editions of The Deserted Village and The Traveller. And he also expressed to Cook this awareness that he had that some people would object to what it was that he was arguing. Some of my friends will differ from me on this plan and think the depopulation of villages does not exist. But I am myself satisfied of the fact I remember it in my own country and I've seen it in this. So he had to, I suppose, at the outset, defend the veracity or the verisimilitude of what it is that he described in the poem. And I think Irish observers ever since then have sort of sought to affirm the Irish reality of what it is that Goldsmith described in the poem. And I think this is a rather amusing quotation from R.H. Newell's 1811 edition of Goldsmith's poems, which is actually a really, and there's definitely a copy of it in the room there with Arthur and Claire in the Ballymahan Goldsmith room. It's the early edition of the poems which has the most sustained effort to link the poem's locations with Goldsmith's background in Longford and Westmeath. So a gentleman in company with the Venerable Dr. Tully of Athlone, a good Athlone name, objecting that the description of Auburn could not possibly be intended for LeShoy, Goldsmith being in England at the time that he wrote it. Do you suppose, sir, asked the doctor, that Milton was in hell when he wrote Paradise Lost? Of course not. So there's absolutely no reason to think that the fact that Goldsmith was in London meant that he had completely forgotten about and was not thinking about what had happened in Ireland and the certain things that he'd observed over the course of his upbringing. So several critics and scholars in the earlier part of the 19th century and Goldsmith biographers as well sought to kind of pin down, if you like, and to geotag, I suppose would be the more contemporary phrase, Goldsmith's verse. So Edward Mangan made an attempt at clearing up the contested question as to the precise scene of Goldsmith's deserted village, and an explicit link was drawn between the depopulation and deracination and denudation that's described in the poem and the encroachment of one General Robert Napier of a family of Dorset extraction, who had acquired some of the land in the area and had evicted some of the Dillon family, who were one of the the older landowners in that region. And there's a sort of a political subtext to that, insofar as the Dillons were part of kind of a Jacobite culture in the Irish Midlands. So Napier, then, having taken over this land, began to enclose it and to eject local respectable families. So that very process of eviction and emigration that Goldsmith describes in the poem is linked explicitly to these events which took place and to these personalities that were agents or actors in the Irish Midlands in the 18th century. So Goldsmith, as Newell remarked, contrived to give an English character to circumstances and objects plainly and originally Irish. And Pádraig Colum, another great Midlands writer, made note of this as well. He said that his love for his own people and his remembrance of the Napier evictions are at the roots of the deserted village. It might be described as the first Irish agrarian poem. So, having observed certain developments in Britain along the Edgware Road and further out into Oxfordshire, and also drawing upon his remembrances of his Irish background, he created the deserted village, and it was an instant success. So, as I say, published in May the 26th, 1770, 251 years ago. It went through several editions in pretty short order, and the 5th edition would appear by the later part of the summer of the very same year. And critics raved about its beauties in London, which of course was where most of the reviewing, the immediate reviewing, was done. But they did voice their reservations about its economic argument. So a most beautiful structure, though we think it is built upon a very sandy foundation, or rather it is a rainbow castle in the air, raised and adorned solely by the strength of the author's imagination. For we cannot believe that this country is depopulating, or that commerce is destructive of the real strength and greatness of a nation. And I suppose the thing is, for the English observer, commerce was not destructive of the real strength and greatness of England at that time. But some English trade policies and imperial policies, just as they had been in the case of Swift a generation before, had been very destructive in Ireland. And that was the environment which verified the argument that Goldsmith wanted to make. So in terms of the key passages of the poem, I think the idea of the rood of ground maintaining its man, this is another image from Stephen Reed's 1907 illustrated edition. The rood of ground maintaining its man is the key expression in Goldsmith's poem, I think, of the idea of self-sufficiency. And also the idea that you didn't necessarily have to work all the clock around in order to make a living for yourself. There was an idea that Goldsmith clung to throughout his career, which is that exploitation was a terrible thing, and that really society should be set up in such a way that people had a measure of a social life, a social being, because that's the most important thing to retain. For him, light labour spread her wholesome store, just gave what life required, but gave no more. And that also recalls Thomas Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard, this idea of people with limited ambition, not necessarily being objects of scorn, but being the sorts of people who could contribute to a greater social good. His best companions, innocence and health, and his best riches, ignorance of wealth. So that idea is there in the deserted village, and it's there in the Vicar of Wakefield as well, as I've included a note there, just to give you a sense of the sorts of notes that I add. I kind of cross-reference the expression of certain ideas right across his writings. And also, I footnote for the more contemporary reader things like rood of ground, which is, as you'll see there, a unit of land roughly equal to a quarter of an acre. And also, just to give another sense of the important lines, and I think some of this connects with some of what Jim has been talking about. This is the sort of the figure of the man of wealth and pride, or the sort of the representative of private capital who begins to destroy the rural environment. Amidst thy bowers, the tyrant's hand is seen, and desolation saddens all thy green. One only master grasps the whole domain, and half a tillage stints thy smiling plain. So you can see that there's a shift that's beginning to take place, and it's something which Goldsmith noted with regret, the fact that lands were being privatized and enclosed, and people were setting up landscape gardens on them at the expense of the population which had farmed that land for generations. And this is a complaint that in some sense he inherited also from a contemporary or near contemporary poet from Westmeath, from just up the road from Ballymahan, in fact in Ballymore, who in the Parting Cup or the Humours of Juck and Durish from around about 1740 had written a poem which many people conceive to be a major influence on the deserted village, in which it is lamented that tillage is giving way to other forms of farming which are not as good for the rural population. So tillage, Goldsmith argues, and he's kind of mixing his Irish complaint up with some of his English observations, is being displaced by landscape gardening. So in Ireland, you could say, according to Lawrence White, the tillage has been replaced by pasturage. In England, tillage has been replaced by the man of wealth and pride and his fascination or his fetish for landscape gardening on a grand scale. So all of these things together really are versions of the same sort of same sort of will to privatization and the handing over of common good to private interests. So to stint then in the OED, the half a tillage which stints thy smiling plain is the limitation of the self-sustaining agricultural environment. So here the meaning is that Auburn has been limited by the decline of tillage. So even now, the devastation has begun and half the business of destruction done. Even now, methinks, as pondering here I stand, I see the rural virtues leave the land. So there's that line which gives us the theme of today's or this weekend's festival. And he also goes on to evoke in several passages actually the ills which await the emigrating villagers. So first of all, there is the loneliness and the poignancy of the scene in which families are separated at the Strand. And subsequently in the poem, he'll also go on to describe the hellish environment, the dangerous environment which awaits them in a wilderness in America. And he dramatizes these environments, the dangerous environments on the other side of the world, as a kind of a contrast to the beauteous and sort of pastoral scene which these families are leaving behind. So there we have the very same thing evoked by the wonderful imagery of Stephen Reid. Downward they move, a melancholy band. We see the rural virtues leave the land. So what are the rural virtues then, according to Goldsmith? Well, I think they are precisely some of the things that Jim has talked about in his talk. They're the ideas of community. So you talked about farmer to farmer sharing. This idea that it's not pure competition or capitalism that drives rural life. That sustainable agriculture is key, and that we have a responsibility to hand these things on one generation to the next. Frugality, which perhaps is another way of talking about community, that it's not simply fractious competitiveness amongst and between families. Luxury throughout the deserted village is one of Goldsmith's key complaints. And by that, he means a number of social ills. He's talking about imperialism. He's talking about the disorder which happens when everybody is chasing some sort of garish or gaudy wealth. So there's a lack of jealousy in the environment and in the idyllic scene which Goldsmith recommends, and which he exemplifies really in Sweet Auburn as it once was. But the problem for some observers then and for now, and for critics over the intervening 250 years, is that the deserted village does seem to be quite a fatalistic poem. So he may make these recommendations for the improvement of society, but he also seems to suggest over the course of the poem that perhaps things have gone too far already, and that perhaps the way of life which he celebrates in Sweet Auburn as it once was has been so definitively overtaken by developments, this kind of first wave of globalization and imperial adventurism, that there might be no way back. But I think the idea of a festival like this weekend's, is to think about Goldsmith's poem and what it meant in its own time, but the sorts of warnings which resonate with us still. So he does offer something of a solution towards the very end of the poem, but he also, for some critics and scholars, he seems to have gone so far as to suggest that even the solutions which he comes up with here might not be enough. But he does want to teach erring man, and he wants to use his poetry to teach erring man to spurn the rage of gain, to teach him that states of native strength possessed, though very poor, may still be very blessed. The trade's proud empire hastes to swift decay as ocean sweeps the labored mole away, while self-dependent power can time defy as rocks resist the billows and the sky. So those last 4 lines of the poem, which may have had an input from his great friend Samuel Johnson, they do seem to tie together this one idea that seems to be very, very important in terms of a prescription for what might happen to society now, which is that people should emphasize frugality, but also self-sufficiency as a means of sustaining the way of life. So just to return by way of conclusion to John Montague, whose 1972 poem, The Rough Field, or series of poems within a poem, I should say, draws upon Goldsmith. So he'd written about Goldsmith critically, but he also drew upon him in his own poetry. And he sort of gives a sketch, if you like, of different types of pastoral scenes, such as Palmer's image of the Vale of Shoreham, Chagall's lovers floating above a childhood village, remote but friendly as Goldsmith's Auburn. So our finally lost dream of man at home in a rural setting, a giant hand as we pass by, reaches down to grasp the fields we gazed upon. Harsh landscape that haunts me, well and stone, in the bleak moors of a dream, with all my circling, a failure to return to what is already going, gone. So the question which Montague raises, and he's kind of hearkening back to the deserted village, which he describes as a sort of a rural version of T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. It seems to suggest that things cannot be saved, that they might be going, gone. But I think within Goldsmith's poem and with other versions and reimaginings of it, such as Montague's and Ivan Boland's, and the image of it in John McGahern's screenplay, The Rockingham Shoot, and in the writings of Lona Groark, it resonates with us still as a poem which creates an image of the type of Ireland which we dreamed of and which we, to use Eamon de Valera's great phrase, and which we might dream of still. So I'll leave it there. With thanks to all for listening.
Thank you very much for that excellent session, Dr. Griffin, and for comprehensively demonstrating the infinite resonance of Goldsmith's writing, particularly The Deserted Village. While his words and those expressions may be centuries old, the comparisons between rural life and agriculture back then certainly still ring home today. So thank you again for making all those connections and also drawing on those similarities with Professor Kinsel's presentation. And just before we move on to our next speaker, I just want to remind people of the chat function on Zoom. If you have a comment that you want to make about some of the presentations or a question that you want to ask, type it into the chat function and we will have a panel discussion with the speakers afterwards. And then also on Twitter, our hashtag is Goldsmith, hashtag Goldsmith21 if you want to get in touch. I'll just read out some of the messages we've had in. So we've had a message from this was in response to Jim's presentation from Anne Sheridan. I am watching while sitting outside surrounded by the doubts of our 4th generation dairy farm. The birds are singing in the hedgerows. The mature trees are a natural shade. Silage is cut with a wide swath left for the flora and fauna on the verges of the field. I share your optimism, but I'm gravely concerned at the direction taken by present government. 60,000 jobs linked to dairying. We use the skills and practices of our predecessors, and a similar volume as your grandfathers is on a shelf in our kitchen. So thank you very much for that comment, Anne. Donal Macanvaha, one of our committee members, says excellent presentation, Jim. Thank you very much. And there is a message from Mairead Canela. This is in response to Dr. Griffin's presentation. And she writes, similar attitude towards arc capitalism in the expanded British Empire at the same time, in particular the East India Company. And just 1 year later, the East India share crash took place. It would be interesting to see if the critics would have had a similar attitude had The Deserted Village been published in 1771 instead of 1769. And other thanks also, Michael, for your presentation. So just to move on now, I'd like to invite our final speaker of the evening, Dr. Eamon Haughey, to join us. Dr. Haughey is an assistant lecturer at GMIT, whose research is focused on sustainable agriculture and climate change. Previously a postdoctoral research fellow at Trinity College Dublin, Dr. Haughey has investigated the interactions between climate change and land in Ireland. He also contributed to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Special Report on Climate Change and the Land in 2019. Prior to this, Dr. Haughey was a scientist with the Cocoa Life Sustainability Programme of Mandalas International, owner of Cadbury's. He holds a PhD in Applied Plant Ecology from UCD and Teagasc, in which he investigated the effects of drought on agricultural grasslands. Dr. Haughey, again, it is a great honour to have you here with us tonight. I'll hand over to you now for your presentation on climate change and Irish agriculture. Focus on the solutions.
Thanks very much, Claire. Can you hear me okay there? Presume the sound is working okay.
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Yeah, loud and clear.
Good stuff. Thanks very much. Okay, so I hope this follows on quite nicely from what we've heard already from Jim and Michael. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the reports that Claire mentioned there that I've been involved with in the last couple of years. And I suppose just to start, really, I want to talk a little bit about agriculture and climate change in the global context, but then try and focus down onto the solution side of things and look towards where we might go in the future, and hopefully end in an optimistic tone. So just to start, really, where are we in terms of climate change? So I think one of the challenges with climate change in general is that it's a global problem. And it's a global challenge, but yet the gases that are causing this this issue are happening at a local level. So it's quite different to something like when we have pollution in our local rivers, for example, or our waterways. This is a global problem, which means we need global solutions, and I think that's one of the particularly difficult things about climate change. So where are we in terms of global warming? So since the year 1750, so around the time, I would guess, Goldsmith was, before he went to London, as Arthur mentioned at the start, since then we have seen a massive accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So we have an increase in carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and all of these are causing global warming. Some of the recent data on this, just to put it in context, from the World Meteorological Organization, indicates that the increase in carbon dioxide is continuing unabated. You see this trend from 1985 in the graph here. And unfortunately, although it's been over 30 years since the first report from the IPCC on climate change, we see very little impact really in terms of carbon dioxide increase. So that's where we are. And I suppose this harks back a little bit to that discussion around globalization and intensification across the planet. And we see this ceaseless increase. So essentially, this is what's leading to an increase in global temperatures. And I think one of the things that's difficult again is to visualize this in a way that sort of brings home that change. So this next slide here, I hope this little animation will play. So this essentially is going to show from 1880 up to the present day, changes in temperature compared to that pre-industrial period. So the blue areas are below average or below that period, and then the yellows and reds are above. So if we play this through, you'll notice at the start of the last century, there was quite a few years that were mainly blue across the planet. Then there were some yellows and oranges. But as we move towards the latter half of the last century, particularly up to the 70s and 80s, we see a lot more warmer values. And particularly then in the last decade, we see a very worrying trend of increased temperatures. So this is, it's not something that's talked about in the future any longer. Unfortunately, climate change is something we can measure as already happening now. And that's why I think in the last few years, we've seen a greater sense of urgency really about this issue. So that leads me on to talk about, I suppose, the first of a few reports that I'm going to mention. But this report from the IPCC a few years ago on global warming of 1.5 degrees, this report essentially was requested by governments from scientists following the Paris Agreement. And they wanted scientists to do an assessment of this, this warming level and what it would mean. So the first thing I think is important from this report, and it gained a lot of traction in the media, and I think that was a very positive thing. But the first thing to say is that the scientists estimated that we will reach 1.5 degrees of warming between 2030 and 2052. So not that far away. And that's at the current rate of warming. The other thing they looked at was they did a comparison between 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees of warming globally. Essentially, they asked the question, what difference would that half a degree make? And they found actually it would make a very significant difference. There would be smaller reductions in the yields of food crops, and several 100 million fewer people would be exposed to climate-related risks. So essentially, that makes a very strong case for trying to limit warming to 1.5 if possible, certainly below 2 degrees Celsius. And of course, that means we need to act soon. The other thing they looked at was essentially the carbon or the greenhouse gas budgets associated with these levels of warming. And there's a lot of detail in the report on that. I think the key part or the key message from that really was that we're not locked in to greater warming levels than 1.5, but we are on track to hit that in the coming decades. So significant action required, and really all the action then centers on reducing these greenhouse gas emissions. So as you see from the previous slide there, that increase in CO2 doesn't look like it's slowing down. So that needs to be turned around pretty rapidly. Then looking at greenhouse gas emissions, I think this graph comes from the EPA in Ireland. So this is the European picture of greenhouse gas emissions per person. And there's various ways you can calculate this, but per person is often one that's used. And you'll see Ireland here. We're not doing too well in the European scale of things. So per capita, we have the 4th highest emissions in the EU, and that's around 12.5 tons of CO2 per person. Now, this is sort of an abstract enough number, but if we compare ourselves there, for example, to Croatia, Malta, and Sweden at the other end, we're about double the emissions per person. So we have a significant challenge ahead of us. And this, of course, applies to all sectors, really. The second thing really to mention then on this is if we look at the bar there for Ireland, it might be difficult to see on your screen, but the little green and brown part of that bar represent methane and nitrous oxide emissions. And those are the emissions that are closely related to agriculture. So you'll notice that those are essentially a larger proportion for us than the other European countries. And this is why agriculture is almost, has to be central to any changes we make to our greenhouse gas emissions here in Ireland. So I suppose that's a sobering graphic. The challenge is large. It also talks a little bit about complexity and the land system. So I was lucky enough to be involved in the team that worked on this IPCC report that came out in 2019. And this report focused on climate change and land specifically. And the reason that this came about was because the governments asked for a report that dealt with this complex issue, because the land system has such a complex relationship with the climate system. And indeed, the Irish government were one of the governments, I think 7 countries requested such a report. And the Irish government did support several of the meetings that we held back when we could meet in person for this report. So some of the findings from this one, so the authors here looked in a lot of detail at risks to agriculture and food security. And I suppose the key message is that as temperatures increase, we increasingly face the risk of major food system failures. So if we think about commodity crops like wheat, rice, maize, so they're important around the world. If a region were to have a severe climate event, a region that produces a lot of those crops, that risk of negatively affecting the whole global food system becomes more and more severe as temperatures rise, essentially. So that was quite a stark warning. And that agriculture really is at the forefront of risk, relying on predictable weather patterns, essentially. So there's a lot of more detail on that in the report, and I think that was a very valuable piece of work. The other thing that the report did quite a bit of detailed assessment on was the emissions from the land system, and also how the land stores carbon in soils and biomass, like forestry and so on. So there was quite a bit of work went into that, trying to quantify this balance, and it's quite a difficult thing to quantify in practice. But a key finding from that is that although land is part of the problem, it can also be part of the solution to climate change. If we have, for example, more forestry in some places, we might have more bioenergy and so on. So these can be part of the solution as well. So there's a really positive message from that. The other, I think, possibly less reported finding from this report was a warning that as temperatures increase, this potential the land has to store carbon will be reduced. If you think about forestry, if we're going to have drier summers in the future, there'll be more risks of things like wildfire, for example. That's just one example, but on a global scale, at greater temperatures, the land won't be able to store as much carbon. So this is quite a worrying thing, because if we rely on the land to do that, we could run into trouble in the future as well. So that's the global picture. So I suppose following that piece of work, then I did a piece of work funded by the EPA and the Department of Agriculture, looking specifically at what all this means for Ireland, really, and trying to downscale some of these findings into an Irish context, because the IPCC reports focus on the global level. That's their remit. So some of the content wouldn't be necessarily directly relevant and so on for Ireland. So this piece of work, and the report was published just last month, it looks at this in a few different sections. So there's a chapter looking at land use and also the outputs from land system in Ireland, then the greenhouse gas emissions related to all that activity. And finally, there's a focus on what can be done. So the solution side of things. And I think that's probably the majority of the report actually is on the solution side. So that report's available on the EPA website. I made every attempt when writing this to make it accessible to non-technical experts. It's still a scientific report, but I've tried to minimize the jargon. So hopefully that's a useful resource to anyone who's interested. And I'm going to talk about some of the findings from that. sort of as a framing really in the next few slides. So land use in Ireland, the map here shows land cover. So this is satellite-based data. And what you can see here in the light green is pasture. So as most of us would be well aware, we're dominated here by pasture land, by grassland. So this in turn means that the agricultural production we have is dominated by livestock, and ruminant livestock in particular. So that has knock-on consequences for our greenhouse gas budget as well. You'll see some other, the colors here, so that the cropland area is in yellow or gold there on the map. You'll see most of it in the south and east of the country. There is a significant and important part in Donegal, I will say as well, but the most of it's in the south and east. And it's interesting that it was mentioned by Michael as well early on, the cropland area, and at present it's relatively small. And this is due in some ways because it's constrained in terms of soil, but also constrained probably by the commercial nature of tillage farming nowadays. So there are other parts of the country for sure that probably could be tilled, but maybe the scale at which they could be tilled might be different. So I think that's a really interesting area to think about. But the cropland area is really important because it is, at least in the way it's farmed now, it's quite limited. The brown area on the map here is the peatland area. So in the west and the Midlands and the uplands. Now this area is really important as a carbon store. But the bad news, I suppose, from a climate perspective is that because of the way we've managed the peatlands and used them for fuel, converted them to agriculture or forestry, they're largely in a degraded state. So they're no longer growing, they're no longer soaking up carbon. In fact, the vast majority of them are releasing that back into the atmosphere, which is an issue. The other thing, which is really important when we think about the climate challenge, is the level of forestry we have. So at present, we have just under 11% of forestry cover in Ireland, which is very low by European standards. But it's important for us to put that in context that just over a century ago, we had less than 1.5% of forestry cover, which is extraordinarily low. So it has increased from a low base, but in the last few decades, we have seen actually a decrease in afforestation in Ireland. And there's a lot of issues around forestry, and I'll mention some of them later on again. So that's the situation with land use. Another aspect to all of this, of course, then is the economic side. So what are the outputs in terms of value to the economy and so on? So it's quite a lot of data in this table, but the key takeaway really, I suppose, and this is 2018 data, is if you look at the top two rows there, we have dairy and beef production, and their importance in terms of value is massive compared to the other parts of agriculture. So just as our grasslands dominate the land cover, in economic terms, dairy and beef dominate the outputs. And that was something I wasn't aware how dominant that was actually until I did this piece of work. The other thing I suppose to take away from this table is that we have a relatively low diversity of major outputs from agriculture here. So the cereals there's only a small number of cereal crops included really in this in terms of the main economic outputs. So it's not very diverse, it's very specialized. And this is a result really of what Jim talked about, and that's that move towards specialization, intensification that we've seen, and probably not very resilient either. And that's important when we think about the climate side of things. So that's the snapshot, I suppose, of land use and outputs. Chapter 3 of the report then, this looks at the greenhouse gas emissions. So all these things essentially have knock-on consequences for the budget that we have. So the EPA produces an inventory every year. An awful lot of work goes into that. And I'm going to summarize that in one slide. So really, for more information on this, I'd say have a look at the EPA website or another source really. But at the high level, agriculture, and as we've seen from the little bar chart early on, it contributes a significant portion of our overall emissions. So around 28.8%. And to put this in context, the average for the EU is around 10%. So we're an outlier in that regard. And it's because of the type of agriculture that we have. So we have ruminant livestock, and they produce a lot of methane. So 65% of those agricultural emissions are methane, and that comes predominantly from cattle. The other side of it is we have nitrogen-related emissions, and these are associated with fertilizer use or slurry spreading on the land. And as we intensify land use, we tend to increase the amount of nitrogen inputs and therefore increase the emissions as well. So it's a big challenge to turn this around for agriculture. I think in particular, because of the low level of cropland we have at the minute, we're sort of have an uphill battle really to make any headway. The other part of this inventory, so it's sort of an accounting system really for greenhouse gases. The other part of that looks at land use change in forestry, and this includes things like soils, the peatlands as well. So the good news on this side of the equation is that forestry is a significant carbon sink. That's really good. And if we increase the area of forestry we have, that could increase as well. However, on the negative side here is that these degraded peatlands we have, including those that have been converted to grassland and forestry through drainage, they're a real significant source of emissions. And unfortunately, they outweigh all the good work that's been done there in terms of forestry soaking up carbon. Interestingly as well, something I don't think is very well grasped often, is that these organic soils actually outweigh in terms of emissions the carbon that's locked up in the grasslands that are on mineral soils. So although that's a very important stock in those grasslands, it's actually outweighed quite considerably by the organic soils. So again, we have an uphill battle here. On average, this category in Europe is a net sink, whereas we again have an uphill battle on this front. So setting out a very challenging picture here, but there is hope. There's a lot that can be done. So the IPCC land report, as I said, it focused a lot on solutions. So trying to work out what we can do with our land to address climate change. So there were 40 options assessed in that report. And what I did for the report on Ireland was try to see how do they fit in here to our land system? How applicable are they? So I did essentially an assessment of them. And from that, 12 of the 40 options came out as highly relevant. So those 12 options are shown in the table here. And we're talking about things like changes to diets, reducing food waste, several options on agriculture that I'll talk a little bit more about, but also things around bioenergy. We don't do much of that here. We could. Increasing our forestry cover. And then also re-wetting of peatlands, which is a very hot topic at the minute. Not forgetting this biodiversity crisis that we're facing as well, and needing to integrate that into it. So these are obviously quite broad categories, and in each one then there's specific actions that can be done. But these ones were seen, according to the assessment in the report, as the ones with most potential. So there's a message really there of hope that there's a lot that can be done. And I suppose an important thing to mention as well, that some of the options are good for mitigation, so either preventing greenhouse gas emissions or storing carbon, but other options are particularly good for adaptation, so preparing us for the new normal of more extreme climate that's going to happen and that is already happening. The other thing that you run up against when you do an analysis like this is that there's sort of knowledge gaps and barriers to implementation. So lots of these things aren't new. They're just not done here in Ireland. So try to pick that out a little bit in more detail and try to work out what could be done. And I suppose it's really a starting point as opposed to an end point. So just to look at the agriculture related options there in a little bit more detail. So the first couple of options there that were assessed were all focused on improving grazing land and livestock management. And these tend to be things about efficiency. Some of these things are high tech, some of them are low tech. So for example, changing how slurry is spread on the land, so using low emissions techniques. This has good potential, but it's costly. The change to new machinery and so on is costly, so there's an issue there. Breeding more efficient livestock. Teagasc are doing a lot of work on that and have been. Multi-species grasslands, which Jim mentioned as well, so taking up clover and more than just grass species. This has great potential to reduce the needs for inputs, and as does improved soil nutrition and management, really. So soil testing to make sure that when nutrients are applied, that it's done in the most efficient way. So these are all things that can be done, and I think there's a great lot of hope there. I suppose the flip side of that, though, is that we can experience what are called rebound effects. So when we look at efficiency in particular, there's this risk. So this is what we've actually seen in Ireland in the dairy sector. So if you compare the efficiency of milk production to 30 years ago, you'd find that it's far more efficient nowadays, which is a good thing. But because the dairy herd has grown and the intensity has grown, essentially, the overall emissions, unfortunately, are increasing despite those gains in efficiency. So the efficiency is sort of, it's important, but if you have this growth rate that can outstrip that benefit, then you're essentially cancelling out a lot of the good work that's been done. And the nature of climate change is that the atmosphere doesn't really care where the emissions come from as such. So that's a problem that we have to face, I think. But there are other things we can do as well. So looking at a bit more sort of different ways of managing the land, so more aligned really with the agroecological approaches that Jim mentioned early on. So agroforestry is one of these systems. So you see in the picture there, livestock and trees in the same landscape. So the potential here is really good because we have carbon locked up in those trees. We also have additional income streams in the future for the farmer. You have timber, but you still have some livestock there as well. So that's, multiple income streams. That's adding more resilience to economic shocks, to climate shocks, and you're storing more carbon. So this has a great potential. Unfortunately, at the minute, in Ireland, there's very low uptake of the current schemes that the government have in place. So one of the recommendations of the report is to do a piece of work to review that really and understand why it hasn't been successful to date. But in other parts of the world, this is becoming more and more successful. So it can be done. Another option that we're hearing a lot about at the minute is agricultural diversification. Again, it's a very broad term. Essentially, if you think back to that table there that we looked at early on with the agricultural outputs, it's relatively low in terms of diversity. So if we had more horticulture, we wouldn't have to import as much vegetables and fruit and so on. I know if I go to the supermarket, I'll try and buy Irish vegetables and fruit when I can, but it's a struggle to find that a lot of the time. And I think that could certainly provide an opportunity for diversification. And I think a lot of people would want to contribute to that if they could. It's just maybe we need to see how that could be economically driven, I suppose. More diverse agriculture as well would give us more resilience. And this is really important from the climate perspective. If we think of there was a drought event in the early summer in 2018. There was a fodder crisis following a wet winter and a cold spring in 2013. Because we're so reliant on very efficient grassland systems, this had a real impact. I remember, I think it was 2013, they were making silage in Dublin Airport or hay or something of that. So the system we have is very advanced technologically for a lot of our dairy farms in particular, but not necessarily that resilient to these shocks. So I think if we have more diversity, maybe go back to more of the mixed farming that would have been commonplace in the past, that's going to be really beneficial in the future because we're going to have more extreme climate events for sure. We know that. Hopefully it won't be that extreme if we can limit the global warming, but we need to build that resilience in, I think, now as opposed to trying to wait, because agriculture is going to be at the front end of those risks. So I suppose just a few closing comments really, and maybe some questions or open comments. The first thing to say is that the land system we have in Ireland is particularly challenging when it comes to climate mitigation because it's a large source of greenhouse gas emissions. So we're in a pretty tricky place. Also, if you compare how we're doing to other European countries, clearly we're well behind where others are at. So it's going to be a challenge, and agriculture is going to have to play a part in that. But there are significant opportunities, and I think it's important to focus on what can be done. So a lot of research has been done in the last number of years to improve efficiency. Maybe now we need another focus on maybe more diverse farming systems as well. There are barriers to uptake. These are mentioned in some detail in the report, and I think this is important. It's very difficult for an individual farmer to try and start a whole new, effectively a new sector. So if you think about bioenergy, growing willow is a great potential option in parts of Ireland where there's wetter soils as a bioenergy source, but it's very difficult for anyone to start that. So we need cooperative movements, really, I think, and support from government to make that possible. Social acceptance is not something I've talked about much, but this is really important around forestry in particular. So at the moment, we've seen a lot of forestry moving towards the north and west of Ireland, and a lot of local communities are not happy about that. They feel that it's been pushed on them to allow intensive agriculture to take place in other parts of the country. And I think we're going to see similar social acceptance issues around peatland restoration as well. So we need a lot more interaction, I would say, with the social sciences and local communities being involved in planning and implementing any of these activities, because if we don't, I can't see how that's going to get traction really to be rolled out on large scale. And the other issue around this, of course, is biodiversity. So a lot of our biodiversity at the moment is located on our what are referred to unfairly, I think, as marginal grasslands. So the low input grasslands where you tend to have suckler systems and sheep, a lot of the biodiversity in those grasslands is still there. But if we put forestry on them, that's at risk as well. So it's going to be really difficult to balance this in the future. But I think certainly we have to get the local communities engaged if that's going to happen. So I suppose this poses a question, I think, and it's quite an adversarial debate at times around climate change and agriculture in Ireland. But I think across the board, there's consensus that having a thriving rural Ireland is a highly desirable thing. But I think what's a lot less clear is what would that actually look like in terms of agricultural production, in terms of people in rural communities who aren't involved in agriculture. So lots of people live in the rural areas, but don't maybe work directly with the agriculture sector as well. But I think that lack of vision is important as a barrier at the moment. So really, we need an articulated vision, I think, for the future. I'm an optimist, so I think we can achieve an awful lot in terms of climate. We can also achieve rural farming communities that are more resilient as well. It is possible, but it's certainly going to be a significant challenge. So just to wrap up, I just want to acknowledge the botany department in Trinity, where I was based for most of this research, and as well the IPCC team in London, and of course the EPA and the Department of Agriculture who funded the particular piece of research. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you for that thought-provoking and eye-opening contribution, Dr. Haughey. I think it was really great to give the data and the tables and let people see what the science is saying. I think it's, while this information sometimes can be quite technical, I think it's important to illustrate it. And obviously you're highlighting the challenging situation that agriculture finds itself in, but also highlighting the possible solutions that are within the sector's grasp. So thank you very much for your presentation. Now we have actually lots of comments coming in and questions, and I'll just read some of the comments here to begin with. We have, let's see. This is a comment about Jim's presentation from Donald. Jim, your description of Irish agriculture. Oh no, I read that one, sorry. From Mairead, Dr. Kinsela's talk was very interesting, and I thought the very careful consideration given to the blend of traditional practices helping to drive agricultural efficiency is interesting and very much at a zeitgeist of helping to address the ongoing biodiversity crisis. And then to Eamon, some very worrying, this is from Donny Keys, some very worrying facts coming from Eamon's talk. The standard of all lectures are excellent this evening. So I might just go to some of we'll just go straight into the questions and answers session. So if all the panelists could just be ready to take some questions. Let's see, there's first one here for Jim. Jim, what is the #1 way we can make a substantial difference today to ensure the vibrancy of the agricultural sector?
That's an easy one, Claire. Nice, easy one to start with. In many ways, I think just coming back to Eamon's final points around the challenges to the model that we're currently adapting or have adopted in agriculture, which has been quite narrow and specialized, how we can evolve from that. I'm not talking about fundamentally turning away from it, but I'm saying how can we evolve from that more specialized, narrow type of agriculture to adding other things on. And Eamon used the term, diversification. And there's a kind of a simplistic understanding of diversification as if it's, stick on something else onto the farm and that constitutes diversification. It's much more fundamental than that. I think we need to look at that there are critical resources on a farm. The land, if there's stock, there's stock of biodiversity, but there's also labor and knowledge on the farm, not embedded just in the farmer, him or herself, but also in the farm household. So we need to think about how can we diversify thinking around everything that is available. And there's really good examples, Claire, out there around moving away from the narrow specialized model to people who are adding on new services. For example, the notion of therapeutic services on a farm through something like social farming is a good example where you can continue milking your cows or having your beef animals, but you've added on something. So there's a value added there. And I think, the answer to the question about, how, what can you change, or how do you change, or how do you get out of this kind of narrow specialized focus, is looking much more holistically at the resources of a farm, household, land, stock, everything, and reconfiguring it, still producing your beef, still producing your dairy, but producing other things with it, or maybe producing it in a different way. I mean, organic farming would be an option. If you think about, can you add value? Can you change the way in which you produce a commodity in order to change maybe the cost base and ultimately the profitability base? So hopefully that gives some insight into an answer to a very difficult question.
Thanks for that. Oh, sorry. Thanks for that, Jim. That's no very clear answer there. There's actually a tricky kind of a question here from Thomas. Is it possible to get around the methane issue without limiting the herd or reducing farm output? So I suppose, Eamon, you might be willing to take that one up.
Yeah, that's a tricky one, all right. I think the key fact is that 65% of our agricultural emissions are methane. So if you don't tackle that in some way, it's quite difficult to make a large inroad then. There's a lot more hope, I think, to tackle nitrogen-related emissions, because we can do things with different fertilizers and clover and so on. But with methane, it's still very tightly linked to the herd number. The national flock has actually decreased a fair bit since the 1980s, so sheep contribute less now than they did then. So it's difficult to make inroads with that one if we don't see maybe decreases or maybe even a cap on the size of the herd in some way. There's hope that there may be additives to feed that might make an impact, but they're not at market yet, and they look to be a fair bit away from that. So I wouldn't bank on them. I think it'd be far better to try and maybe envisage areas where there would be less livestock but more diverse income streams. Still some livestock, but maybe could we envisage something where we have use that diversity as a way to give people different and more viable incomes. It's not going to be easy to do that. I suppose it's important to mention as well that the economic side of things, the suckler farmers in particular, it's very difficult for them to make a living as it stands. So it's not working very well. So I think maybe the question is a bit about what is a thriving rural livelihood? What does it look like? That's different perhaps to a thriving beef industry. So maybe that's, it's a tricky one, but I think, I think diversification does have some potential, maybe small areas of forestry as well on farms, but yeah.
Thanks. Thank you for that response, Eamon. There's actually another question for yourself here as well, asking this, I suppose, about the consumer, whether the consumer will be willing to pay more for, say, a packet of scallions is the example given here, if it's more environmentally produced. So do you think the consumer will be willing to pay more for that product?
I think there's, in theory, yes. When they do surveys on this, people who on their way into a supermarket, they say yes, but when they look at the basket when they've come out, it's often that they've gone for the cheapest product, unfortunately. So there's research, I think, to show that that's not always easy to achieve. But I do think there's an appetite from a lot of people to pay for more sustainably produced products now. And I think that really is growing. So I worked in the past for Cadbury's. So they have a cocoa sustainability program predominantly in Africa, and a lot of corporations like that who are requiring resources from countries in the developing world in particular. They're investing heavily in sustainability because they know their consumer wants that and demands that. And they're not doing it purely for the good of their own health. They're doing it because the consumer is demanding it. So I do think there's scope, and I know it's there's always a chance people will go for the cheaper option, but at the minute you don't have the option for a lot of our fruit and veg. So I hope people would sort of back that up if it did become reality.
There, could I just follow Eamon's answer there with this is a really interesting focus on the role of the consumer in all of this. And I think we can often lose sight of that we can be very family focused, and all the pressure is on the farmer to make the change in response to the challenges we're talking about. I think consumers have a huge role. We're all consumers. We have a huge role in the decisions we make as to answering again Eamon's question about, what would a thriving rural Ireland look like? Are we prepared to invest in it? Are we, as consumers? We can say what government also has a role in it, but are we prepared to pay that additional premium for commodities which are produced locally? And they mightn't look as good, they probably taste better, but they mightn't be packaged as neatly. Are we prepared to pay for that? So I do think we can't allow consumers off the hook in this debate, because it's we're all in it together. And I did reference in a few words I said at the start that it is about the farmers, it's about rural residents, but it's also about urban residents. We're all in this together. So I think it does focus. The responsibility is a collective responsibility if we want solutions. It's not a responsibility which can be carried exclusively by the farming community, or indeed exclusively by a rural community.
I think that's a really excellent point, Jim. Thank you very much for sharing that. We have a question in now for Michael, an interesting one. Who can be identified as the poets of the current rural environment? If you have any suggestions there. And there's actually another question, Michael, asking what made you decide to tackle the subject of Oliver Goldsmith, and how did you get into the field and why did you stay with it? So who do you think are the poets of the current rural environment, and then just on your own story, why did you decide to tackle the subject of Oliver Goldsmith?
Thanks, Claire, and thanks for those questions. I think the question about who are the Goldsmiths of the current rural environment, it's a very interesting question. It's not a particularly easy one to answer either, because I think we think of contemporary poetry, we think of something which is slightly more modern, or I should say more urban, or even suburban. So even when Yvonne Boland was writing her poem about reading the deserted village in her own time, it was really a meditation on Dundrum and the changes that had taken place in Dundrum, from a sort of an outlying suburb to becoming increasingly kind of a centre of consumption with the Dundrum development of the shopping centre and so on. So I think trying to isolate, if there was one, if I could give one suggestion, and he was our colleague here at the University of Limerick as a writer in residence last year, and he hails from Swinford in County Mayo. He's a poet by the name of Martin Dyer, who published a wonderful first collection called Maiden Names. Now, if you have any teachers in the room, you might be aware of one of his poems by the name of Death and the Post Office. And it's a wonderful piece. But really what he does there is, it's quite a Goldsmithian poem insofar as it's about that kind of emblem of rural society, which is the small village post office, which of course is being whittled away, if you like, something which is inefficient, even though it is a hub of the community. So just as the bare-worn common was to Goldsmith in the 1760s, the centre of a sense of community, so too did the post office fulfill a certain function, where the person who worked in the post office had an awareness of everything that, all the various tasks that needed to be taken care of for the village to function smoothly. And what he does in that poem is he talks about, the idea that somebody would be sent in as an envoy of a kind of a modernity, and their purpose was to dismantle the post office because it was no longer economically viable. But the idea in the poem is that they would be, in some sense, charmed by what the post office stands for, and ultimately would be unable to do their job. So it's, I think for me, it's one example of a contemporary poem which tries to do what the deserted village did in its own time. It has been on the Leaving Cert in recent years. And I think it's a gorgeous poem. It's a gorgeous collection, all told, Maiden Names, and I think you should have another collection on the way pretty soon. So that's one example. And as I say, I think otherwise you are talking about people who are, I suppose, commenting in some way on the sort of a generational break, really, between the poet and their rural background. I think Heaney is a very good example of that, and of course, he comments upon the sort of the distance that grows between himself and the figure of his father, who is the farmer, as he becomes more sophisticated, supposedly, through education, but he still has this kind of connection to his father and to his father's, and it's sort of a great admiration for his father's skill. But he sees that his father is kind of slightly looking sort of confusedly at the career that his son has chosen for himself. So there's a kind of I suppose a shift that's going on there in Heaney's own career. So I think of poets, a lot of contemporary Irish poets, as having become urban or suburban, and they're kind of commenting upon the move away from that. So I think the most recent poems that I think does a kind of a Goldsmithian, engaged with Goldsmithian themes would be Martin Dyer in Death in the Post Office. So to answer the other question, why did I get involved with Goldsmith? Well, I was very interested in the 18th century, very interested in the Enlightenment more generally. And that's one of the things that I talk about. The deserted village is probably my favorite thing by Goldsmith. But his career is extraordinary. He wrote across all of the genres and produced a massive amount of prose, where basically his purpose was to convey key ideas from the French Enlightenment and contemporary scientific advances to the audience in London at the time. So he contributed, if you like, to the Enlightenment information industry in all sorts of interesting ways. And as somebody who's interested in the Enlightenment and interested in poetry, Goldsmith is somebody that appealed to me. And when I started to work on him, I don't think I really fully understood just how appealing he would be in terms of the variety of things that he wrote. and the sheer skill with which he engaged with topics upon which he was not expert. Things like natural history. For instance, I think Samuel Johnson once said about him, whether he knows the difference between a cow and a horse might be the extent of his knowledge of natural history. But he did not touch anything. And this, the same Samuel Johnson said that he did not touch anything which he did not adorn. So he might not know, the ins and outs of what he was actually writing, but what he wrote beautifully. So he was a kind of a great purveyor or a synthesizer of contemporary knowledge, and made it accessible to such a wide audience. And his books were school texts as well throughout the later part of the 18th century and early 19th century. So even though he wasn't an expert on British history, his way of writing about it made it available and accessible to generations and generations of school kids. So they're just some of the reasons why I'm ensconced in Goldsmith studies.
Thank you for that, Michael, and we're delighted that you have such a strong interest in Goldsmith and you're keeping his legacy alive, and so we're very grateful to you for that. A couple more questions here this is for Jim and Eamon. Maybe Eamon, you might take it first. Asking, do you think the new CAP, the new Common Agricultural Policy, will really assist in fostering and helping nature to recover and reduce agriculture's carbon footprint? So do you think, I know we don't really have the full shape of the next CAP just yet, but on what we're hearing from 80% or so of it that has been agreed, what do you think of what's been agreed? Is there enough there for us to recover and reduce agriculture's carbon footprint? So Eamon, if you could take that first, please.
Yeah, I think it's it looks like it's going in the right direction. It looks like there's going to be a lot more payments towards agri-environmental schemes that reward actions that are done. I think that's a positive thing, and the research seems to back that up. So if someone plants a hedgerow, for example, and does a really good job of it, and it really functions very well, attracts a lot of wildlife, whereas the neighbor down the road doesn't do as good a job, half-heartedly does it just to get the payment, in the future, I think those two won't receive the same payment. So the farmer who's made the bigger effort will get more reward. I think that's fair, really. I think that's a good thing, but it's going to be difficult to implement that. And that applies as well to other schemes. So there's hope that there might be schemes around carbon in the future. So encouraging activities to sequester more carbon. I suppose the devil's going to be in the detail, because there's quite a bit of flexibility in CAP with how each country as well implements it. And as you've seen, I think I mentioned agroforestry. I know Jim mentioned it as well. There are some schemes in Ireland at the minute to promote that, but they're not taken up. So that's something that we don't maybe always think about. It's possible to have a scheme for farmers that no one wants to take up because it's not that attractive, or there may be certain limitations on it. So it actually comes down really to that detail in the end. So it's sort of it's hard to say at this stage, really, I think, how effective it's going to be, but it has to change because there's a big drive for more sustainability across Europe. We're an export country when it comes to agricultural produce. So if we're pushing that green label, our origin green type label, as an exporting country, we have to be able to back that up, or we're in danger really of undercutting the whole thing. So I hope it is effective, but I think the devil's going to be in the detail.
Thank you for that response, Eamon. And I'll just pass over to Jim if you want to give your views on that. If you think the next CAP is what's your view on how it's shaping up, and will it achieve the goals as set out?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Eamon in terms of that. It seems to be, all the indications are that it's going in the right direction. So therefore, it will provide incentives to, assist nature to recover and to reduce carbon footprints. But I think it needs to do it quite sensitively, from getting the balance right with the economic as well, and the social. That, we do have to remember that farm households are at the center of this. I know I talked about consumers earlier on, But at the center of the decision making are the farm households, and the incentives which are available to them can be attractive to do certain things. I mean, the REP scheme was a very good example of that. It made modest agri-environmental changes in the period that it was run. But I do think that the jury is out still as to what the real impact of the new policies will be from a social and economic point of view as well. I think it's very clear that it's going to do there's going to be real effort and real investment in the addressing the environmental and related climate issues. But we do need to figure out and look very carefully at what it's going to do to farm households.
Thank you also for that, Jim. And we're getting lots of messages in here just thanking you for the answers and just the quality of the responses. I know we're over time here. Do we have time for maybe?
We'll just maybe take one more, I think.
Okay, and well, there's one here I'd like to get in. Again, this would be to Jim and Eamon. And I actually have one more for Michael if we just have time.
Okay.
For Jim and Eamon, what would you say are some of the most common misconceptions people have about agriculture, and how can we combat these misconceptions and communicate more effectively? So maybe Jim, you might take that one first.
Yeah, I was hoping you'd give it to Eamon so I could just say I agree with Eamon. It's a little bit more, it's a bit trickier than that. I think the big change in mindset has to come around the recognition that agriculture has always been and will always be very knowledge intensive. And rather than be simplistically led by technology and machinery and gadgetry, we really need to go back to basics. And in some ways, I was trying to get that across earlier on in the presentation. The understanding of soils, the understanding of plants, the very basics, in some ways, is what we do need to go back to understand those and to appreciate those. They're really fundamental to good farming. So really what I'm saying is how we define good farming needs to be rethought. It needs to be revalued. It's not how big the tractor is or how big the herd is or whether you have a rotary parlour or you don't. It's much more about the knowledge base. And in some ways, the old farming, if we want to call it that, was very knowledge intensive. It spread across a whole range of enterprises on a farm, and the farm family had to be able to apply their knowledge and skill set to that. So it was far more complex. It mightn't look as tech heavy, and it wasn't, but it was much more knowledge intensive. So I do think, we really need to redefine the application of knowledge, our knowledge, into farming systems. But I'm sure Eamon will give a more comprehensive answer than that. I hope he does anyway.
No, I think it's the knowledge aspect, and I think that links, of course, to the more diverse systems require more knowledge, really, and a wider breadth of knowledge. And I think one of the things that it's been quite interesting in the last couple of years to be working in the area of climate and the interface with agriculture, because it's been quite adversarial at times, the debate. I think one of the misconceptions is that it's overly negative, really, that agriculture is very negative in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions and so on. There are a lot of really important, aside from the essential nature of food itself, other qualities that agriculture provides. So we think about the size of farms in Ireland. I think maybe there's something, Jim, you mentioned as well. It has changed, but if we compare ourselves to maybe the US, for example, the farms there are on average much larger, and they're so large that neighbors are literally miles apart. And we don't have that yet. We still have a relatively high number of small farm holders, and that gives us that spread of human life in the rural areas. So I hope that is maintained. I suppose my worry, coming from the Northwest as well, is that if we do see this increase in forestry that's probably going to be needed for climate solution side of things, we don't want all that just in one part of the country. I don't think that's fair, for one thing, but I also think there's a real risk that we lose a lot of the coherence of the communities where that is. And I think there's a social justice element to that. And I suppose you could make similar arguments around re-wetting of peatlands. So there's a real transformation happening quite rapidly now. All of a sudden, when we think about Bord na Móna, they're rebranding themselves now. And it's taken a long time to get to that change, but it's happening quite quickly. And I do worry that if we're not careful, we won't bring people along with the process. And but yeah, there's a lot of positives. I think that's my answer, which isn't a very good one either, maybe, but and it tends to be overly negative, maybe, that debate, and overly adversarial. So I would hope there is more common ground there if we can try and find it, I hope.
Thank you very much for that, Eamon. And I'm glad you raised the point of Bord na Móna as well, because there is lots of questions out there at the minute about the just transition and how just it actually is, and the speed and at which the changes are coming. Just one final question to Michael. Just a viewer asking about for advice on the best resource for people who want to dive deeper into the legacy, into the works of Oliver Goldsmith. Now, obviously, it could be your own works, but is there any advice you could give someone who wants to learn more about Goldsmith?
Well, I think you could probably pick up Vona Groark's recent Gallery Press edition of The Deserted Village, which has a really gorgeous introduction, which situates the poem very much in its immediate environment. So that's a paperback edition of the poem, which I think would be very useful. And there's a great Oxford World Classics edition of The Vicar of Wakefield as well, which has a beautiful introduction by a guy called Arthur Friedman, who's the last great Goldsmith editor who edited the collected works in 1966. Who I suppose we're just trying to take everything that's happened in the meantime and take it on but it's now 54 years old, that edition. So you can access all of it. I suppose the greatest resource, one of the greatest resources for Goldsmith studies in Ireland is the Ballymahon Goldsmith Room. There are some gorgeous editions of Goldsmith going right back to the 18th century in that room for anyone who wants to dive in. There's also a wonderful collection of editions of the Vicar of Wakefield in the Heavey collection in the Athlone Library, which is another gorgeous collection, another great resource. But in terms of just diving in and having your own copies, I think probably the Vona Groark and the Arthur Friedman editions are great places to start.
Great, thanks very much for that, Michael. And I know we've gone over time, but those responses are really interesting. And again, we've got some huge thank yous in there from our viewers saying that your questions were wonderfully answered. So thanks very much for that. So I better draw things to a bit of a close. So a sincere thank you to all our guests, Professor Jim Kinsella, Dr. Michael Griffin, Dr. Eamon Haughey. It has been a really stimulating evening. And on behalf of the committee, we are very grateful and appreciative of all your knowledge and understanding in your own individual fields. And thank you for sharing your projections and thoughts on the road we must take from here for agriculture. And Dr. Griffin, again, thanks for all your vital work in keeping Goldsmith's history and stories alive at national and international level. Thank you also to our viewers and for all your time staying with us this evening. I hope you enjoyed it. Members of the press, local supporters, sponsors, and everyone else for joining in. We really hope you'll be back with us tomorrow night, where we're going to tackle the economic sustainability of Irish agriculture with another wonderful panel of guests, including independent TD Michael Fitzmaurice, leading economist Professor John Fitzgerald, writer, actor and director Seamus O'Rourke, and well-known Longford dairy farmer Andrew McHugh. I'll hand back over now to our festival chairman, Arthur Conlon.
Thank you very much, Claire. And I think we've had a wonderful evening. It exceeded our expectations. And for those who were in the webinar, I think it was pretty flawless. So It has been a wonderful experience to be part of this here tonight. Going to give a special thanks to your host for tonight, Claire McCormack. I think her namesake, Claire Byrne, will have a rival shortly. I think she did an absolutely excellent job. So I know you're clapping out there, so I know I can't hear you, but it's a sort of a virtual round of applause for Claire. She did an absolutely wonderful job. And I know we have 2 more nights to go, but I'd like to just compliment the committee at this stage. Every person has really, really worked hard to make this happen. And, you know, it's not easy. There's a lot of things that have to go right. There were some access issues on the webinar tonight. I think it was to do with the fact that you needed to have a Zoom client or the app installed. But I suppose it's a bit like one of those, it's a bit like the tent. When you're the tent at the Galway races, when you're inside it, the crack is good, and when you're not, well, that's it. So for those who were inside the tent, we had a great evening. So we had in the morning, I think it's at 8 o'clock, Damien O'Reilly's Countrywide program on RTE. I believe Monica Gorman, who's speaking on Sunday, is going to be speaking, and it's in conjunction with her appearance at the festival. So that's going to be a nice little bit of publicity for us on RTE, and Monica should be very interesting. Just one more note, you would have heard some flute music at the start, and that just wasn't recorded, or sorry, that just wasn't taken down off the internet or off a CD or that's actually one of our members, our social media guru, Donny Keys. We're multi-talented here. Goldsmith was multi-talented, but I think some of our committee members are as well. So Donny's flute playing at the start was absolutely gorgeous. And I'm just going to draw one piece of attention to Michael. I might get you to zoom in on the maquette if you don't mind, please. This statue maquette it needs to be called, has an amazing provenance. It goes back to the 1860s, and I believe it was used as a sort of a mock-up or a trial for the statue by John Henry Foley at Trinity College. So we do have Goldsmith looking over us. So we're looking from behind us, and I hope he was happy with what he heard tonight. So look, that's me finished up. As Claire said, she's told you what's happening tomorrow. We're all looking forward to it. We'll try and work to get our extra attendees in, the ones that were there. So after a great start, we'll see you all tomorrow night, and thank you so much for taking part in this virtual first night. And special thanks then, I know Claire was thanked, but Jim, Eamon and Michael have made an absolutely amazing contribution. Your commitment to what you've been asked to do has been absolutely wonderful, and we really appreciate it. Thank you, lads. And you know you have the links to tune in for the next couple of nights as well. So thank you. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, we will see you tomorrow night. I have to press end sometime, so I'm just going to do it now. Okay, thank you.